Everyone has their cross to bear. It's one of the most common phrases in the English language, religious or not, said about a bad boss, a difficult in-law, a body that doesn't cooperate the way it used to. It's become shorthand for one simple idea: life is hard, and you carry your hard thing the way everyone carries theirs. There's something genuinely comforting in that phrase, a shared solidarity in suffering, and it's not hard to see why it's lasted this long. Jesus is the one who gave us the phrase in the first place. "Take up your cross and follow me," he told his disciples, not once, but on more than one occasion, in more than one setting, including an earlier moment recorded in Matthew's Gospel when he sent the 12 out on their own mission, well before he had told them plainly that he himself would die this way. So the modern use isn't inventing something from nothing. It's drawing on a real saying, spoken more than once by the same teacher in more than one context. But go back to the room this phrase was actually spoken in, and to the world his listeners were standing in when they heard it, and a considerably less comfortable picture starts to form. A cross, in that world, wasn't a metaphor waiting to be coined. It was a Roman execution device, reserved for slaves and rebels, and the people Jesus was speaking to had almost certainly watched a man carry one through their own streets. Which leaves an honest question worth sitting with. If "take up your cross" meant something that specific, that final, to the people who first heard it, what exactly did Jesus think he was asking his disciples to do? To answer that, we have to go back to the specific world his disciples were standing in, and the specific empire that had made cross a word everyone in that world already understood. It's roughly AD 29, somewhere in the region of Caesarea Philippi, in the far north of Galilee, near the base of Mount Hermon. Jesus and his disciples have walked far from the crowds that usually surround him. This is quiet, remote, deliberate, a full day's journey, by most reconstructions, from the villages where he normally taught. And it's here, away from the noise, that Jesus asks his disciples the question the whole scene turns on. Who do people say that I am? Then, more pointedly, who do you say that I am? There's a detail worth noting about the location itself, chosen, it seems, with as much care as the question asked inside it, because it wasn't a neutral backdrop. Caesarea Philippi sat near a rock face associated in the region with the worship of the Greek god Pan and with a temple built by Herod the Great in honor of Caesar Augustus, a place saturated with the imagery of imperial and pagan power, springs and shrines devoted to gods and emperors alike. It's a striking place for a question about true kingship to be asked, standing in the shadow of monuments built to other kings, other gods, other claims to ultimate authority. Whether or not Jesus intended that contrast deliberately, it sits there in the geography regardless, a backdrop of competing claims to power the moment Peter names the true one. Peter answers first, and answers with certainty, without hesitation. You are the Christ, the long-awaited King, the one who would restore Israel. For a fisherman standing in Roman-occupied territory, that word, Christ, Messiah, carried a very specific hope. Rome had governed Judea directly for decades by this point, through prefects like Pontius Pilate, while a client ruler, Herod Antipas, held a fraction of local power in Galilee under Rome's authority. Jewish expectation of a Messiah, in this environment, leaned heavily toward a liberator, someone who would do to Rome what earlier heroes had done to earlier empires, the way Judas Maccabeus had thrown off a foreign king generations earlier, a story every Jewish household in Galilee would have known well. A king, possibly a warrior. Not in almost anyone's imagination, a man about to be executed. So when Jesus responds to Peter's confession, he doesn't respond the way a newly confirmed king might be expected to. He tells them, plainly, for the first time, that he must suffer, be rejected by the religious leaders, be killed, and rise again 3 days later. And Peter, the same man who had just spoken with such confidence, pulls Jesus aside and rebukes him for it. Jesus' answer to Peter is severe. "Get behind me, Satan. You are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." This is the room the phrase is spoken into. Not a calm teaching session, not a parable told to a curious crowd. A tense, unresolved argument between a teacher and his closest follower, immediately after that teacher has announced his own coming death and been told by someone who loved him that this could not be allowed to happen. And crucifixion itself, in this world, was not an abstraction either. It was a Roman method of execution, not a Jewish one. Jewish law prescribed stoning for capital offenses, so a cross was, by definition, a mark of Roman judgment, a punishment imposed by the occupying power rather than by Israel's own courts. Rome reserved it specifically for slaves and for those it wanted to make a public example of: insurrectionists, rebels, anyone who threatened imperial order. It was designed to be seen. Execution sites sat along public roads, deliberately visible to travelers, and in the decades surrounding Jesus' ministry, Judea had already witnessed uprisings against Rome, answered with exactly this kind of mass, public execution. This was not folklore to Jesus' audience. It was recent memory, or close enough to it, the kind of story a grandfather might still tell, or a scar a neighbor might still carry, from a raid that ended in a roadside execution. There's a deeper background worth naming here too, one that helps explain why Peter's resistance was so immediate and so strong. Centuries earlier, the prophet Isaiah had described a figure Jewish tradition sometimes calls the suffering servant, one who would be despised, rejected, wounded, and led like a lamb to slaughter, bearing griefs that were not his own. Isaiah 53 sat alongside other, very different messianic expectations in Jewish thought. Pictures of a conquering king restoring David's throne. Both strands existed side by side in Israel's own scriptures, held together in tension for generations. But by Jesus' day, popular expectation, shaped as much by present political frustration under Rome as by careful reading of the prophets, had largely gathered around the conquering picture rather than the suffering one. Peter had just confessed the conquering king. Jesus was now describing the suffering servant. That collision, more than simple confusion or fear alone, is likely what provoked Peter's rebuke. A good man, defending the version of the Messiah he had spent years hoping for. It's into this exact moment, a teacher just named as Messiah, immediately followed by news of his coming death, immediately followed by his own disciple trying to stop it, that Jesus turns to all of them and says the words that would eventually be smoothed into a phrase about difficult mornings and long weeks. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Start with the word itself, the one Jesus actually used, stauros. In everyday first-century Greek, it wasn't a religious term at all. It was simply the ordinary word for an upright stake, and by the time Jesus is speaking, it had become the standard word for a Roman execution post, not a metaphor borrowed from somewhere else, the plain, functional name for the device itself. This matters because of who's in the crowd hearing it. These aren't seminary students turning a familiar theological term over in their minds. These are Galilean fishermen and a former tax collector living under direct or indirect Roman rule in a region that had already seen Rome answer rebellion with public execution. When Jesus says stauros, he isn't reaching for a symbol. He's naming the actual instrument some of them may have watched used on someone else, possibly on a road they themselves had walked. Picture the difference between a modern audience hearing someone say, "Take up your electric chair," versus hearing, "Take up your cross," today. One lands as raw and specific. The other, after 2,000 years of church art, jewelry, and architecture, lands as gentle, even decorative. Jesus' listeners had no such distance from the word. For them, there was no soft version of this image available yet. No cross necklace. No cross on a steeple, only a post, and what happened to the people nailed to it. So the very first thing worth noticing, before we even get to what carrying a cross meant, is that Jesus chose the least metaphorical, most literal word available to him. Not a general image of hardship, the actual name of the device his empire used to kill people. Which raises the next question. If the word itself was this specific, what did it actually mean, in practice, on an actual road, to carry one? Most depictions of this scene, paintings, films, even church art, show a man dragging an entire cross behind him, the full upright post and crossbeam together, an enormous weight across his shoulders. It's a striking image. It's also, according to the historical evidence we have, almost certainly not what Jesus' listeners would have pictured, and likely not what happened even at his own execution. Roman practice, as reconstructed from ancient sources and forensic evidence, including the skeletal remains of a crucified man named Yehohanan, discovered outside Jerusalem in 1968, indicates that the condemned typically carried only the crossbeam, the patibulum, to the execution site. This beam was roughly 1.5 meters to nearly 2 meters long, and the weight of it alone was already considerable, somewhere in the range of 30 to 40 kilograms by most estimates, while a vertical post, the stipes, was left standing, already fixed permanently into the ground, waiting at the destination. The condemned man, already weakened by a flogging beforehand, a beating carried out with a short whip embedded with pieces of bone or metal designed to tear flesh rather than simply bruise it, would have this beam bound or laid across the back of his shoulders and neck, arms sometimes tied along its length, and walked, under armed guard, through public streets toward that waiting post. Every part of this process, from the first stroke of the whip to the final steps toward the waiting post, by design, moved in one direction only. There was no version of Roman crucifixion that included a return trip. A man who began that walk did not get to change his mind partway through, set the beam down, and go home. The flogging, the walk, and the post were not 3 separate risks he might still avoid. They were 3 stages of a single sentence already being carried out. By the time a man's shoulders felt the weight of that beam, every decision that mattered had already been made by someone else, and nothing left in the process depended on his consent. Look closely at that detail, because it changes something important about the picture. The condemned man wasn't hauling an entire execution structure. He was carrying one specific piece of it, his own beam, toward a post that was already there, already prepared, before he ever arrived. Think of it like walking toward a grave that's already been dug. The hole doesn't need to be dug when you arrive. It's simply waiting. All that's left is the walk, and the part of the structure that belongs specifically to you. This is the detail that reframes "take up your cross" most sharply. Jesus isn't describing a man improvising his own execution from scratch. He's describing a man walking toward a death that has already been decided, already prepared, already waiting, carrying only the one part of it that was his to carry. Which means the phrase was never about generalized heavy lifting. It was about a very specific, very final kind of walk, one where the ending was not in question, only the willingness to keep walking toward it. But a walk like that raises an obvious question, one the text itself doesn't leave unanswered for long. Follow that image of the beam a little further, into the street itself, because there's a detail about the procession worth sitting with. Not what the condemned man carried, but how everyone around him understood what they were watching. Crucifixion processions in the Roman world were not private. They were deliberately public, often accompanied by a placard, a titulus, announcing the crime, and routed through visible streets specifically so that as many people as possible would see the condemned man walk past. This wasn't incidental. Public shame was part of the punishment's design, as much as the physical death itself. A soldier sometimes walked ahead of the procession carrying that placard so that the crime and the sentence were legible to anyone who looked. Roman writers themselves were candid about this. Crucifixion was widely regarded, even by Romans, as the most degrading death available, reserved, deliberately, for those the empire wanted to strip of dignity as well as life. Roman citizens were, in ordinary circumstances, exempt from it entirely. The punishment was built for slaves and provincials, for people the empire considered beneath its own protections. To be crucified wasn't simply to die. It was to be publicly declared, by the most powerful government in the region, as someone whose life carried no further claim on anyone's respect. Which means that a man carrying a beam through a first-century street wasn't simply someone facing a difficult future. In the eyes of everyone watching him pass, his future was already over. No one expected him to turn around. No one expected a reprieve. He was, functionally, already dead, walking, but already subtracted from the world of the living, already beyond any claim on his former life, his former relationships, his former plans. This is worth holding next to Jesus' own words, spoken to a group of ordinary men who had followed him, hoping for a kingdom. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross. Not manage a difficulty, not carry a weight while continuing your normal life underneath it. Take up the one thing that marks you, publicly, as someone who no longer belongs to their old life at all. Not a call to endure something hard while everything else stays the same. A call to walk out into public view already having surrendered every claim to the life you were living before, the way a condemned man had already surrendered his, before he ever reached the post waiting for him. There's one more detail from this same scene worth pausing on, because Scripture gives it to us almost as an afterthought, though it's anything but. When Jesus is finally led out to his own execution, according to all three synoptic Gospels, he does not carry his own beam the entire way. A man named Simon, from Cyrene in North Africa, likely in Jerusalem for the Passover festival, is pulled from the crowd and compelled by Roman soldiers to carry it for him. Mark's Gospel adds a small, easily overlooked detail. Simon is described as the father of Alexander and Rufus, two names Mark's original readers apparently already knew, suggesting these were real, identifiable figures within the early church community Mark was writing for, not literary inventions. That detail matters less for what it proves about Simon himself, and more for what it tells us about how this account reached us, not as a distant legend, but as a memory still connected, when Mark wrote to a specific, identifiable family. A real man forced into a real road, carrying a real beam that did not belong to him, at the exact moment Jesus' own strength, after the flogging, had apparently given out. It's worth noticing the timing of that detail too. Jesus is the one who spoke the words, "Take up your cross," months earlier, on a quiet mountain in the north. And when his own moment to carry a literal beam finally arrives, his body, weakened by the beating that preceded it, could not finish the walk alone. Even the man who gave the command needed another set of shoulders under the weight before the walk was through. If you've never pictured it that specifically before, a man already considered dead, walking past people who have already stopped expecting to see him again, that's the moment this phrase stops sounding like a comforting idiom and starts sounding like what it actually was. That shift is the whole reason this channel exists. Subscribe to the Scripture Project if studies like this are the kind of thing you want finding you, because there's still a word we haven't dealt with, one that sits in only one of the three gospel accounts of this same saying. It does something strange to the image we just built. A one-time, final walk toward a death that's already been decided, and yet this one gospel writer adds a single word that turns that walk into something you're apparently expected to take again tomorrow. That single word, daily, is worth pausing on, because it seems, at first glance, to work against everything we've just established. Every version of this scene we've examined so far describes something singular, a specific procession, a specific beam, a specific post, already fixed in the ground, waiting for one specific walk that ends one way. That's the picture Matthew and Mark both give us. Take up your cross, full stop. But Luke, writing his own account of this same moment, adds one word the others don't include. Let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. Daily, kath hemeron, in the Greek, a straightforward, undisputed phrase, not a rare or debated term, every day. Sit with that for a second, because on the surface it seems almost contradictory. How do you take up something final, something that, by definition, only happens once, to a person who isn't coming back from it every single day? A man doesn't walk to his own execution repeatedly. He walks once. Luke seems to be asking his readers to do something that shouldn't, logically, be repeatable at all. Now hold that tension, And look at the word right next to it in the same sentence, the word usually translated deny. Let him deny himself. In Greek, aparnesasto, from the verb aparneomai. This word isn't unique to this passage. It shows up again, later, in all three synoptic Gospels, describing one specific and very memorable failure. On the night of Jesus' arrest, Peter is asked 3 times whether he knows this man, and 3 times he says no. Matthew's Gospel records it plainly. Peter began to deny it, and then, a 3rd time, denied with an oath, "I do not know the man." The verb used there, the exact same root, aparneomai, is the verb Jesus used back in Galilee when he told his disciples to deny themselves. Put these 2 moments side by side, and a pattern starts to surface that's easy to miss on a single read-through. The same disciple who is told, early on, to deny himself, is later the one who denies Christ instead, using, in the Greek text, the same verb both times. Many scholars have noted this echo. It's a widely observed connection, not an obscure one, though the extent to which it reflects deliberate authorial design versus simply the natural vocabulary available for describing denial in Greek is something commentators discuss rather than something the text states outright. But even holding that caution honestly, the shape of it is hard to ignore. One denial is aimed inward. Deny yourself, your own claims, your own right to your former life. The other denial is aimed outward, in fear, at the very person who asked for the first kind of denial in the first place. Same word. 2 entirely different directions. There's a second connection worth laying alongside this one, older and more distant, though it belongs to a different category of evidence entirely, closer to a long-standing pattern of Christian reading than to a claim the New Testament text makes explicitly. Centuries before Rome ever built a cross, a father named Abraham walked up a mountain called Moriah with his son Isaac, and Scripture tells us plainly that Isaac himself carried the wood for what he believed would be his own sacrifice. Genesis doesn't record Isaac saying a word about it. He simply carries the wood up the mountain toward an altar his father is about to build. Many readers across the centuries, both Jewish and Christian, have noticed the outline of this scene resurfacing much later, in a son carrying his own wood toward his own death outside Jerusalem. This is typology, a recognized pattern of later fulfillment echoing an earlier picture, not a direct citation Jesus or the Gospel writers make explicit in this particular passage, and it's worth naming honestly as an interpretive tradition rather than a proven textual link. Genesis itself never tells us what Isaac felt climbing that mountain, whether he suspected, whether he was afraid, whether he trusted his father's word that God would provide. The text is silent on all of it, which is part of why later readers have found so much room to reflect on the scene. But even held at that careful distance, it adds one more layer to the picture already forming. The theme of carrying the very wood your own death will require is not new to this moment on the road to Caesarea Philippi. It has old roots in Israel's story, roots that stretch back to a father and son on a mountain long before Rome ever built its first cross. And this is where daily stops being a contradiction and starts making sense. If self-denial were a single, one-time event, like the literal, final walk of a condemned man toward a cross he'll never walk back from, it would only need to happen once. But Peter's story shows exactly why it doesn't work that way in practice. The pull to protect yourself, to reclaim what you thought you'd already surrendered, to deny the harder word instead of the easier one, doesn't disappear after a single decision. It returns. Sometimes in a courtyard, at night, in front of a servant girl, when the cost suddenly feels real instead of theoretical, which means Luke's daily isn't softening the image we built earlier. It's applying it honestly. The walk toward death to your old self isn't something you complete once and then carry as a finished achievement. It's something that has to be chosen again, tomorrow and the day after that, because the same hands that let go yesterday will, if given the chance, close right back around what they released, exactly the way Peter's did, on exactly the night it mattered most. A mountain near Caesarea Philippi. A question asked twice. Who do people say I am? Who do you say I am? Peter answers first. You are the Christ. And for one moment, everything feels settled. Then, it isn't. Jesus tells them what kind of Christ he actually is. Rejected, killed, raised. And Peter, the same mouth that just spoke the truth, tries to argue him out of it. Get behind me, Satan. Into that argument, Jesus says the words that would outlive every empire in the room. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, and take up his cross, and follow me. Not a phrase yet, not decoration. A word borrowed straight from the street. Stauros, the plain, unglamorous name for a Roman execution post. A beam, not the whole structure, just the piece that belonged to you, carried toward a post already standing, already waiting, already decided. A man walking like that wasn't struggling through a hard season. He was already gone, already subtracted, already in the eyes of everyone watching him pass, a dead man who simply hadn't finished the walk yet. That was the image Jesus reached for. Not a metaphor for a bad week. A picture of a life fully surrendered, in public, with no road back. Years earlier, a father had climbed a mountain with a son who carried his own wood without a word of protest. Now a teacher stood on a different mountain, near shrines built to other gods and other kings, describing a walk his own followers hadn't yet seen him take. A servant, compelled from a crowd, carrying a beam that wasn't his. A flogging first, then a walk with no return trip built into it anywhere. Every stage of it moving one direction only, toward a post already standing, already waiting, before the man carrying the beam ever left the flogging post behind him. And then, one gospel writer adds a single word that shouldn't fit. Daily, a final walk, repeated every day. It shouldn't make sense, until you notice the other word sitting right beside it. Deny. The same word, exact same Greek verb, that shows up again later, in a courtyard, at night, 3 times, from the same disciple who first heard it on that mountain. Peter denied himself once, in theory, on a hillside. Peter denied Christ, for real, by a fire. Same word, 2 directions. Which is why daily isn't softening the walk toward the cross. It's telling the truth about it. The grip doesn't release once and stay open. It closes again. Overnight, if you let it. In a courtyard, if you're afraid enough, take up your cross was never about carrying a burden through an unchanged life. It was about a life already surrendered, and a surrender that has to be chosen again and again, every time the old hands start reaching back for what they already let go of. Most of us will never carry a literal beam down a literal road, but most of us know what it feels like to say yes to something, fully, sincerely, on a good day, and then feel our grip tighten right back around it the moment it costs something real. Peter meant it on that mountain. That's worth remembering before we judge him for the courtyard. He wasn't lying when he said he'd follow. He simply hadn't yet met the version of that promise that came with a servant girl's question and a stranger's suspicion and real, immediate danger attached to the answer. It's easy to deny yourself in theory. It's a different thing entirely by a fire, at night, when someone's actually watching to see what you'll say. Most people carry a version of that same gap. A conviction you meant fully in the quiet of a Sunday morning. A decision you made with real sincerity. A surrender you thought was finished, until it's tested somewhere ordinary. A conversation you avoid because honesty might cost you something. A grudge you keep circling back to hold, long after you told yourself, and maybe told God, that you'd let it go. A comfort, a plan, a version of your own future you keep quietly reaching for, even after you thought your hands were already open. That's not hypocrisy. That's just what it looks like to be a person whose surrender isn't a single event. It's what it looks like to be someone who genuinely means a promise the day they make it, and still has to mean it again on a harder day, weeks or years later, when meaning it costs something the first day never asked for. There's a particular kind of quiet shame that can come with noticing this pattern in yourself. The sense that if your faith were stronger, or your character better, the surrender would have simply stayed finished the first time you offered it. But that's not the picture this story gives us of Peter, and it's worth being honest about that. Scripture doesn't record Peter's denial as evidence that his earlier confession was fake, some kind of performance he never really meant. It records both, side by side, as two true things about the same man. He really did believe. He really did fail. Neither cancels the other out, and the text never asks us to pretend it does. The text never pretends this is easy, and it never pretends it happens once and stays finished. That's the entire weight of that one added word, daily. Not because God enjoys watching people struggle through the same decision repeatedly, but because that's genuinely what it costs to keep choosing someone else's will over your own instinct to protect what's yours. The walk doesn't get easier because you've walked it before. It gets asked of you again. There's no promise in this passage that the asking eventually stops, that a day arrives when the grip simply stays open on its own, without further choosing. That absence is worth being honest about too, rather than smoothing it into something more comfortable than the text actually offers. What the passage does promise is narrower, and in some ways sturdier, that the invitation to open your hands again is renewed as often as it's needed, for as long as a person is still walking. There's something worth noticing, too, in the fact that Simon of Cyrene didn't volunteer for the road he ended up walking. He was pulled from a crowd, compelled by soldiers, carrying a weight that wasn't his to carry, on a day that started, for him, like any other. Most people's crosses arrive a little like that as well, not chosen from a menu of noble sacrifices, but placed on your shoulders by circumstances you didn't ask for, on an ordinary morning that suddenly stopped being ordinary. What the text never tells us is what Simon felt on that road. What it does tell us, through everything surrounding this scene, is that carrying a weight you didn't choose, on a road that leads somewhere costly, is not outside the shape of what Jesus asked his followers to expect. And maybe that's what makes Peter's story worth more than a cautionary tale. He denied Christ with an oath, by a fire, in the dark. And the same Gospels that record that failure also record what came after it, a shoreline, a fire again, and Jesus asking him 3 times, "Do you love me?" until the same number of denials had been quietly, deliberately answered. The call to take up a cross was never a call to be someone who never fails at it. It was a call to keep walking back toward it, especially after the nights when you didn't. Maybe that's the quieter comfort tucked inside a phrase that sounds, at first, like it should offer no comfort at all. A word that describes a walk with no way back could easily sound like a threat, a warning against ever loosening your grip even once. But paired with Peter's story, it starts to sound like something else instead, an honest acknowledgement that the grip will loosen and tighten and loosen again, many times, across a single life, and that the invitation to take it up isn't cancelled by the mornings you failed to. It's simply extended again, daily, the word says, not because failure disqualifies you from the walk, because the walk was always meant to be taken again, by people who have already, at some point, set the beam down and picked it back up. A beam carried by a condemned man toward a post that never moved. A beam carried, at the end, by a stranger pulled from a crowd, when the condemned man's own strength ran out. A word, spoken once on a quiet mountain, and lived out, imperfectly, failed and returned to, for the rest of a fisherman's life. Take up your cross was never a call to die once. It was a call to keep letting go of the same thing every day you wake up still holding it. If this is the first time you've heard that phrase, the way its first hearers did, that's exactly why this channel exists, and why studies like this one take the time they take to build, layer by layer, from the ground the text was actually spoken on. Subscribe to the Scripture Project, so studies like this keep finding you. Share it with someone still carrying something they thought they'd already surrendered. And if a line here stayed with you, leave it in the comments. This is a community built on one honest conversation at a time.